was like, okay, let's look into the data on this.
Yeah.
Generally, it seems that the more you teach young kids about sex, the less they have sex and the later they have sex the first time.
Do you think that's because adults are tainting it with uncoolness?
Well, that could be part of it, yeah.
But does teaching kids about sex include teaching kids about abstinence or
Now
like
that
teaching kids
it's
to not have
interesting,
sex?
okay? So you can do abstinence-only education, which
Mm.
actually has a similar effect to general sex education.
Interesting. See, I had thought as a kid growing up and like younger that like abstinence only education didn't work. That's what I always heard.
Well, of
Abstinence
course,
only
that's because
education
that's what
doesn't
they
work.
wanted to tell you.
Yeah.
Like, that fit the narrative.
Yeah.
Abstinence-only education actually does work, but it doesn't seem to work as long as general sex education. The more a community is told to restrict access to these sorts of things, the more they're going to engage with these sorts of things under the radar.
Yeah.
It really seems like the best panacea against over-sexual abundance. So we will teach our kids, basically the answer here is we will teach our kids pretty aggressively and early about human sexuality,
Yeah.
but because we want them to engage in the topic with moderation, and we think that that is the best way to achieve that outcome.
Would you like to know more?
We are getting to do a special recording today because we had the disappointment of setting up all our recording equipment for a Great Britain, what was it, GB News interview.
GB News, yeah.
And this is the second time they've done this to us. But, you know, we always got to be ready for those news conversations. And so we were like, well, we blocked out time anyway. We
So
might
why
as
not?
well take the time to chat with each other.
Which
because
is more fun. Let's
Oh,
be
yes.
honest. A
We
lot
had
more
one of
fun.
those recording sessions ruthlessly stolen from us by a friend, where we had to talk with a friend.
Oh my
Oh my
gosh.
gosh, the burden of friendship.
Really?
Will it ever leave us,
Oh
Simone?
God. I don't know. I don't
One day
know.
I hope to be famous enough that I do not care about alienating myself from friends. And the whole world can be just you, me, and the kids. Won't that be wonderful?
Yeah, except then like the friends that you do hang out with probably just hang out with you because you're famous, which sounds annoying.
No, I don't want any friends. Once I'm at that
Because we just
level,
just would
just
be completely
cut
isolated.
off.
Okay, that's dreamy.
Just
I'm ready for
you,
that.
me, the kids living in our antique farmhouse in the woods.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay.
Or
That's fine.
potentially we're gonna have to go set up our charter city by then, some remote place in the far north, a little settlement, right?
Ah, I don't want to leave this place. I really like it.
I know. So today's topic is an interesting one,
Yeah.
and it has to do with when we think it is appropriate and how we will engage with our kids and the subject of sexuality.
Indeed. Yeah.
And what's really funny is I think a lot of people might see us or they see, you know, they know that broadly, you know, we consider ourselves as very like culturally similar to Ayla, and we're friends with her. You know, we have her on the show sometimes, and then we'd be like, "What? So you want to raise your kids to grow up like Ayla, right? Like, is that your goal?"
Well, not
Whereas
grow up
our
like Ayla because she grew up in an extremely hardline conservative religious
yeah,
household.
our well, I mean, we are an extremely hardline conservative religious household. We just have a different view of sexuality,
Yeah,
and
we're
our
not a sex
response.
negative, extremely hardline, we're conservative religious
Yeah, that's what
household.
you meant. So our response would be, you know, which of us, Ayla or us, do you think grew up not learning about sexuality?
Hmm.
I was exposed to sexual like information at an extremely young age. And I would say it was extremely negative. I remember because I remember, okay, so the house I was living at the time, I couldn't have been older than 7 when
Hmm.
I remember this conversation with my mom.
Oh dear. Okay,
And
so
she
you're
takes
totally
me aside
prepubescent at this point.
and she goes, "Well, Malcolm, you're going to need to be very, very careful because many young girls are going to try to get you to get them pregnant so that they can force you to marry them and take
Oh.
your money. Um,
I
don't
mean,
have
actually,
money."
that's for
Um,
if you have a family that is likely to be targeted for that. uh,
no,
I
I
think
understand. I
even
understand. She had a perception that we were that kind of, and I guess my family more largely was that way at that age.
that
That was sort of before I was
at
really
times your family
excommunicated.
did have a lot of wealth, and I think was known for that.
Well,
I
yeah,
I think
yeah.
also, like, it could be a similar liability if, like, you know that your kid is, like, going to be the high school star, and then, like, women would you need to warn your sons that, like, women will pursue them just for social status. It's not as like
Yeah,
the
well, and I
pregnancy risk
remember
is
she
not as dangerous,
also
but
told me, like, at a pretty young age that I needed to know how to be good at sex. I needed to know how to, like, that this was something that I should take the time to research
wow.
and familiarize myself with. Like, she wasn't, like, creepy, like, "I'm gonna, teach you about all this stuff," which I appreciate, but she
Uh-huh.
was just like, "This is something you can study, and you
Okay.
should take the time to study because it will matter both in terms of your social, popularity and
Okay.
your ability to secure a high quality wife." And as other people who have read other of our works know, one of the things that my mom always enforced me as a young kid is that the single most important decision or accomplishment I would ever make is who I married. So for her to be like, this is really important in terms of who marries you, for her to be like, this is important in terms of who you marry, like she's being like, this is a really critical life tool. And you also grew up with a lot of exposure to sexuality stuff at a young age, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, my parents just left like porn illustrations and like
This is one of the most
books
embarrassing moments of my life at your house. So, do you remember this? So, I'm talking with her dad, and
in the
she was
living room. This is like in like a main like
in the
entertaining
living
room.
room, and I
Yeah.
see on the bookshelf a, like, cool looking, like, anime thing. Like, I thought it
Yeah.
was
So
a
you're like, oh, it's
manga book,
manga. Cool.
and I pull it out, and it is a hentai book
And
in
yeah,
her
pretty
family's living room,
pretty
like, while
explicit.
I'm talking to her dad, that I
Yeah.
pull this out, and I just, like, put it back and pretend nothing happened because I am
Mortified.
mortified.
Yeah.
I think your family is the one extreme I wouldn't go to. I mean, they pushed you into the type of woman who, by the time we were married, I was only the second guy she had ever kissed, much less you definitely had never had sex with anyone before me or anything like that.
Yeah, which
You
is
were
weird because like I mean, as you can imagine, like if a child is knocking about a house where a lot of the illustrated books are literally extremely explicit material, like you are exposed to that sometimes without and no, always without annotation, like, early because you're going to pull the thing with the pictures off the bookshelf, not the stuff with the words. So that was great, interesting, and move on their
Did
part.
your parents tell you about sexuality at a young age? Like,
So
did
what's
you
really interesting is the only sex talk I remember with any parent was with my mom. I remember where I was in the house, and she was basically like, Simone, so when it comes to sex, like you have it's like a precious jewel, and you have a certain number of jewels, and they're very precious, and you just need to be really thoughtful about who you give them away to. And I was really generous with my jewels when I was younger.
she said that?
Yeah, and
I
then
was very generous with
she
my
wouldn't she said she wouldn't she essentially told me she wouldn't have been so generous. Like she basically said I wish I hadn't slept around as much when I was younger, which was interesting. But
what a
my
valuable
my
lesson, to be in this hippie culture growing up, your mom, like her whole shaman thing, she's really into all that. For her to tell you that, you must have been like, wow, she's really serious about this advice.
I was indifferent to it because, like, with you is this really bizarre exception. I'm asexual. Like, I'm not attracted to anyone except for you. Like, and I've been having these sex dreams about you. It's so freaking weird. And it's like, anyway, so like, I have problems with
But this is
you.
only because of the pregnancy, right? Like the
Who knows? I mean, I've always been hot for you, but like now it's just worse. So yeah, probably pregnancy hormones, but who knows? You've also just been extra hot recently and amazing and perfect and the best husband
oh,
ever.
this is sweet.
I am
I
obsessed
have
with you.
a yandere wife here who's always
No,
saying,
like genuinely, like, yeah, I hate everyone else, only have eyes for you. But like, so that means though, like, my mom having that talk with me meant nothing because like I wouldn't
I
have
don't know,
been
you could have
interested.
achieved status. I mean, I believe that the reason why I was so sexually active at a young age, which is less
Yeah.
important for a guy, is
Yeah.
because in terms of like my status on the marketplace is because I believed that it was important to my social standing
Yeah, you
and
were
my
you were trying to yeah,
self-validation.
but for women, that's not the case. I mean, and I do remember like there were some actually women in my high school who I really
Not
respected,
all
who I
women,
thought
some women believe that they can gain social credit for this.
some do. And there were some women in my high school who I thought were really beautiful and way smarter and cooler than me, who did become sexually active in high school, and then I would hear people say things like describe them as cum dumpsters, and think that was kind of weird. But like I had zero one. I didn't think anyone would ever be attracted to me, so obviously, like I wouldn't think about sex as something that I would like
You're so
use.
inherently humble, Simone. It radiates from you.
Yeah, you've also seen me in high school. Like I I was not even close to the top 50%. Okay.
You were
Um,
less attractive than you are today when you were younger. I'll agree
mm,
with that, but I think
mm.
that you were still very attractive.
I
I
was like
know.
in high school, I was like a 3.5, and maybe
Oh,
now I'm
you were
like a
nerd bait in high school.
5,
You
6,
were nerd
hopefully.
bait, but continue.
That's sweet. In college, or sorry, post college, in college and post college, I was nerd bait. In high school, it was a real story. So one, like I never would have thought to use that as a social currency because I didn't think it was a social currency I had. Second, until I met you, I thought I was completely asexual. So like I had no interest. So like my mom saying that to me meant nothing. Basically, like no amount of sex education or lack thereof or abstinence education would have changed my stance and
So
policy around sexuality. And I think this is a really important point. I think that with many kids, they're going to do what they're going to do. If they're the kind of person who's going to just hormonally, biologically have a high sex drive or grow up in a culture that makes them feel like they are sexually attractive and for validation they need to have sex, they're going to have sex. It doesn't matter. So like the only thing you can do at that point is try to encourage safe sex and strategically productive sex.
so I don't think that the evidence agrees with you on this.
Really? Okay,
So
go
this
on.
is something that I had recently looked into before this because I wanted to double check. I was like, okay, let's look into the data on this.
Yeah.
Generally, it seems that the more you teach young kids about sex, the less they have sex and the later they have sex the first time.
Do you think
Um,
that's because adults are tainting it with uncoolness?
well, that could be part of it. Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And there's a whole psychological issue here that we'll get to.
Hmm.
But I think that you see your own experience as being more anecdotal than it really is. And
Huh.
the reality is that the data is pretty robust on this. Like I went through a number of studies on this. It seems it's not like a sometimes the data goes one way, sometimes the data goes the other way, which you sometimes see. The data is profoundly the more you teach kids about sex, the later they have sex and the less sex they have early in their lives.
Okay, but does teaching kids about sex include teaching kids about abstinence or
Now
like
that
teaching kids
gets
to not have
interesting.
sex?
Okay, so you can do abstinence only education, which
Mhm.
actually has a similar effect to general sex education.
Interesting. See, I had thought as a kid growing up and like younger that like abstinence only education didn't work. That's what I always heard.
Well, of
Abstinence
course,
only
that's because
education
that's what
doesn't
they
work.
wanted to tell you.
Yeah.
Like that fit the narrative.
Yeah.
Abstinence only education actually does work, but it doesn't seem to work as long as general sex education.
Yeah, well, because I mean, eventually for the average person, something's got to give, right? I mean,
Yeah. So it is protective. It is not as protective.
it's how you
So the
form
studies
and
that have looked.
soaking, even though they really care about abstinence.
Well, yeah, it's more the studies that have looked at this long term, like 6 months to a year out,
Uh-huh.
show that you get a persistent effect from regular sex education and
Uh-huh.
a non-persistent effects from abstinence only education. Um, and
That
I
makes
think that a
sense.
lot of this comes from the way that you acculturize kids to think about sexuality. As a kid, for example, you get somebody like me, I smoked, right? Like cigarettes, right? Clove cigarettes, of course, because I needed to sleep with all the
So
hot goth girls.
pretentious. I
And the
hate
hot
that.
goth girls were into clove
They
cigarettes,
really
okay?
were, though. Yeah.
So you go and you'd sneak out behind the rock in town and hope nobody saw you. As soon as that was
The
legal for
Rock.
me to
What
do,
town were it?
as soon as I went to college, there was a rock by the lake, and so we'd go into the woods
In
and
New
then
Hampshire.
smoke and hook
Yeah.
up and you know.
So,
But as soon as it was legal for me to do that, I immediately stopped doing it. I
oh,
never did it again in my
that's
life.
so funny.
No, and I'm lucky I didn't become addicted to it because I could have, right? I'm lucky that my
Do you
family.
think clove cigarettes don't have nicotine in them? Could that be
Hmm. No, they have nicotine in them. My
they
family
do?
just historically is not
Not responsive.
particularly susceptible to nicotine addictions
Interesting.
or really any addiction other than alcohol. So, and your family is pretty much like the complete bears when it comes to all
No,
addictions.
it's done everything and it
Um,
doesn't matter.
so I think there was a genetic thing protecting me, and I didn't do it that often. I
Mhm.
literally only did it when I wanted to go hook up with someone.
Yeah.
So it was rare, but it was something I engaged in because it was disallowed. And this is another thing you see in the data.
But so that's why I would expect abstinence-only education to backfire because you're making something forbidden.
Well, it does seem to backfire in the long run, right?
Mm, mm.
But I think the more you engage with sexuality, like the grosser it seems. Okay, so
Yes.
that is one aspect of it, but I think there's more to it than that.
Okay.
I think that if you look at the data, another thing you'll see is so even in adults, if you look at regions by, there was this great study, I think it looked at like how conservatively Mormon regions were.
Okay.
This is a culture that doesn't particularly like masturbation, and it was looking at by zip code,
Mhm.
and it showed that the amount of online porn consumption was correlated with how conservative the area was.
Isn't that marvelous?
And I seem to remember a historic thing about like papal addresses and then sales of Girls Gone Wild that was selling
Oh,
in those ad slots or something.
no. Oh.
But generally, this is something you see over and over again. The more a community is told to restrict access to these sorts of things, the more they're going to engage with these sorts of things under the radar.
Yeah.
It really seems like the best panacea against over sexual abundance. So we will teach our kids, basically the answer here is we will teach our kids pretty aggressively and early about human sexuality,
Yeah.
but because we want them to engage in the topic with moderation, and we think that that is the best way to achieve that outcome.
Yeah, well, and also then that when they do it safely. But so then okay, so, like, let's go a little further with this. Like, I
Well,
think the
not
thing
safely. I don't think that they should go out there and have a ton of sex. I do
yeah, but
not
I
think.
do think that when they do, they should do it safely. So that's part of what sex ed is all about. You know, a lot of what these studies are looking at is when people do eventually
Yeah,
have
but
sex, are
the
they using
point I'm
condoms?
making is that sex ed has a secondary effect,
Hmm.
depending on how it's done. So
Right, and
safe
so what I'm
sex
saying is if we,
out
like, go
outside,
into
don't care
this
about it. Don't care about it. I'm talking safe sex outside, yeah, obviously, you're gonna have more safe
I
sex.
know. What I'm talking about also is the chilling effect of adults teaching you this thing. So, for example, if you and I teach our children, like, oh, by the way, like, if and when you want to try anal, these are like the processes you should go through. Like, here's how to like clean
Make
out
sure you
your
use lube.
yeah,
Yeah.
and you're like, you gotta use lube, you, like, start small, you might wanna start pegging a little bit before you go full out, like, you know, before you this is how you douche properly, here are the various and, like, they're just getting increasingly, like, just disgusted,
If
ashen
your
face.
parents tell you this stuff,
Oh, yeah, no,
this
if
is
we
so
teach our children, like, how to do and, you know, like, you know, here are the various techniques, like, you know, when you go down on someone, you know, that make sure you don't, you know, don't use your teeth, you know, make sure blah, 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 and, like, you know, and you for deep throating, this is some methodology and positioning that may indeed they're gonna die.
right,
And, I
well,
mean,
I
but
don't
here's the
be
thing is
thinking about this. My mom telling me about this
yeah,
whenever they hear one of their friends brag about it, right?
yeah.
So they're not gonna see
Oh,
it as
they're
high
thinking about
status.
their parents.
And two, the
Oh,
first time they engage with it, the
mm,
way you sabotage your kids having sex is bury those memories in their heads,
yes.
not just don't engage with it. And I also think, keep in mind, so if a kid's going out there and they're educating themselves about their sexuality, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They're going on online websites. They're like, okay, what is sex about? What is
Yeah.
those are going to be really sex positive, I think, in a particularly toxic way, in an
Same.
uncritical way. Like if you go online and you look at the places where this is talked about within online communities, they're often very uncritically sex positive.
Mm.
Where I think if you look at something like our book on the subject, The Pragmatist Guide to Sexuality, like if I was in us and I was like, how do I teach my kids realistically about sex? Honestly, the audiobook for The Pragmatist Guide to Sexuality is probably a pretty good place to start because it really makes it not sound cool. It makes it overly analytical. It goes really deep. It
Yeah.
unmystifies a lot of it. With a lot of this stuff, unmystifying it is how you build protection against it.
Yeah, one of our best reviews for The Pragmatist Guide to Sexuality was something along the lines of, "I came to this book to better understand how man loves one another, you know, how we intimately come together. And instead I came away disgusted by humanity. And we're like, exactly,
That was
sir.
our goal.
That
Yes.
was, mission accomplished. You may have given us a 2-star review, but we're keeping it because you know
The
exactly
fire
what we were here for.
hydrant of sexual, like,
Yeah.
eat what humans are actually doing online. It
Big
is the collective delete my search history of humanity, um, being poured down our kid's throat like some sort of torture device.
You know,
Nothing left to do.
we're not gonna say any of this in a sex negative context, although we're also not like we're not ourselves obviously super infatuated by sex.
Oh,
We're
that's
not
something I don't understand at all.
the
The
idea of
people
calling it making love makes me you know.
Yeah, I mean, well, also, I had a high sex drive at a younger age. Because I grew up, again, this is something we talk about. You can tell from people's facial features. My facial features are of somebody who was overexposed to testosterone growing up. The reason I had so much sex growing up, like I mentioned this on other things, I'd slept with 100 different people before I started college. The reason I had done that is because I had this over-driven sex drive.
Hmm.
And a lot of people are like, "Oh, you should as an adult now that you're free, because testosterone goes down when you have kids. It goes down when you're in a long-term monogamous relationship." They're like, "You should want that back." I'm like, "Why would I want that back?"
Mm-mm.
That was not just hell in that it was something that I constantly thought about all the time. It was Simone, right? Like we get receipts and she's like, "Oh no, that could block your test." I'm like, grab the receipt. I'm like, "Simone, I don't want you touching it because you're pregnant with our kids. I don't care anymore. I won the game, right?" Why? Why? They're like, "Well, don't you want to be virile?" I suspect that these people who like go out there hunting for virility have never really experienced like full on male sexuality. So,
Well, and also
uh,
just like how not only logistically cumbersome it is to have a lot of sex, but also like how legally, emotionally, and socially liable it makes you, right?
well, and morally. So, I look at the first
Yeah.
person I had sex with. The first time I had sex with someone, I had gone to this camp that was for nerds. It was oh, you would only get invitations if you had gotten over a certain score on the SATs. And before this, or I think it was like an IQ test or something. Anyway, before this, I had never really, and it was hosted at Cambridge or Oxford or something like that. Cambridge. I had never really done well with women before this moment, but I had just gotten into the period of starting to like try to logistically using online environments, try to understand with, if then statement, like I would use not if then statements, but I would use chains of text when talking to girls online
Oh,
to
yeah.
try to learn which chains worked and which chains didn't. So I'd just begun to like really formalize this process. I get into this environment where I am valued for being nerdy. The first party there, I'm hooking up with 2 girls at the same time behind the party. I end up choosing one of them, and it was literally like basically NTR porn, Netnari or whatever. This girl had been in a long-term relationship. She was a very conservative Christian girl. She was
No.
saving herself for marriage,
Oh
and she was
no.
just like, "I will do any like I'm really really into you. Like I know I've been with this guy forever, but let's just do you. This is what I want to do. Like this is the path I want to take." And
Oh
at the
man.
time, like that was really hot to me. It's so funny. We had this one person on the in the comments once being like, "Oh, Malcolm, you seem like you're into cuckoldry or whatever. Like, do you want other people to sleep with your wife?" And I was like, "You've really read me wrong." Like I used to, and that was something I did a lot. I slept with somebody else's prom date on prom. One of my
Mhm.
friends. I did these things where, as an older person, now looking back on it, it was really immoral, and I feel very, very bad about it.
That's
Like,
good. Yeah,
you
that
think
it's a
you
dick move.
no, I was a dick. I was a dick. I was
Oh,
driven by my hormones at that age,
yeah.
and I didn't have any sort of a moderating moral instruction telling me to do otherwise. I mean, if you look at, who was my moral instructor up to that point, which was my mom, right?
Yeah.
Her position was if you can fuck people over and flex on them and show that you're better than them, then do it.
Yeah, then that's you
Very much a
being
Trumpian sort of mindset.
totally. Well, are we
Um,
gonna teach our kids, our sons especially, some form of bro code? I mean,
Yes. Yeah. No. Well, I mean, I'd say that I will tell them about my background and that I made mistakes. That was bad at the time. I
mm,
thought, and you can even see Trump do this. When I say Trumpian, he brags about sleeping with his friends' wives like as an adult, right? Like
yeah.
long after he should have
No,
known
he's
that that
not.
was an
Yeah,
immoral thing to do, and like
yeah.
trying to pressure his friends' wives into sleeping with
It's the
him.
lack of progression there.
And for me, I view this period of when I was super sexually active as a period in which I broke a number of moral codes, which I should have known not to break.
Mm,
Sleeping with people that were hot, but I didn't respect. Sleeping with people that were no, I never the one thing I was stuck with is I would never hurt their feelings, right? Like
right, which is
if somebody
meaningful.
gave their virginity to me, which happened a lot, like about a third of the people I slept with were virgins. That was like the group that I did best with. I would always try to date them for a specific period of time afterwards. If they wanted that, I would try to. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they were just like, I want practice before I sleep with my boyfriend, which
Yeah.
again, like just me being the fucking antagonist in NTR
But
porn.
that's also kind of sweet if they, just didn't wanna disappoint someone that they
I
didn't feel they could afford to
understand, but I
disappoint.
shouldn't have done it.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so I think people who have never been cursed with this ultra high male sexuality, they do not understand. It's like somebody one day injected me with like meth, got me addicted to it, and I didn't ask for this at all. And
Yeah.
now all of a sudden I'm breaking into people's houses and fucking stealing shit so I can get meth.
Right.
Like it was wrong and it was evil, and I am trying to, as an adult, learn to like not atone for it, but I don't want to go back there. Like I don't want to be like, oh yes, introduce that challenge to me again.
Yeah, although one way to atone for it, of course, is to raise kids to do better. So that is a hope that we have for
Yeah.
our kids then. I think another thing that I think about a lot is when it comes to corn, aka online erotic material consumption, I do think that it creates a certain lack of understanding of like how these dynamics work. And I'm not even talking about like what people are willing to do. I'm talking about what people expect from partners as a default. And I think one of the biggest things that I see in terms of people like problems that people have with sex throughout their lifetimes
Mhm.
that we see people post about online a lot is that partners don't feel sufficiently desired. And it has nothing to do with like I don't care if like they're doing wacky stuff in bed or if they have like zero sex lives. A lot of it comes down to like how desired a partner feels. And if there's one through line through every single like fetish you'll see in erotic material, like the thing that people almost universally, and of course there are some fetish based like differences here, but like it's almost always based around the person being very into banging you, like the concept there, like
Yeah.
enthusiastic interest. And I think a big problem that both men and women have, especially after being exposed to any form of erotic material, and this is romance novels for young women, or like manga, or like typical standard very visual erotic material for men, is they just kind of assume that without putting any effort, you're going to end up with a partner who's showing like insane levels of enthusiasm for you. And like that, unfortunately, that's actually either something that, like, unless you're like some kind of Adonis or you're like really rich or famous, which is kind of hard to do, especially when you're just a kid, you have to put a lot of work into getting that kind of interest. And I don't know how I'm going to approach this with our kids yet, but it is something I want to talk about with you
Well,
because I want kids to understand that like no, a woman or man is not going to be like insane like
I
like cannot control themselves around you.
I no, I've had that with some girls.
Well, that you're you. I
I
mean,
know, I understand, but some people, I assume, I mean, I don't want to say it's an act, but like they know to lean into it. Like I think that the better thing to focus on with kids is, I think, a big problem in our society. Basically, sex, non-reproductive sex, from the perspective of our culture and the way we're
uh-huh,
teaching our kids,
uh-huh.
is no different from pornography.
Yeah, agree.
No different from pornography. It is no additional social standing.
Well,
It
I
is
would say
just
it's probably a little worse because you're more likely to put yourself at physical, logistical, legal, moral risk.
no, it's just pornography with extra steps.
Yeah, and risks.
It's pornography with extra steps and risks. So insofar as it feels better to you than pornography, then engage in it. But if it doesn't feel better to you than that, then don't engage in it.
Yeah.
And or don't waste a ton of time seeking it out. And I think the one of the core problems in the way our society frames this is it puts, corn in one category, actual sex in one category, and then like reproductive sex in another category.
Mhm.
And then there's conservative religious groups, which sometimes are like porn and actual sex should go in the same group,
Mm.
but that whole group is off limits. Whereas we say, no, because they're in the same category, just engage with porn. Don't engage with actual sex unless it is moving you towards reproductive sex. And even in that case, reproductive sex is largely immoral from our perspective if you can engage in polygenic screening. And so, don't overindulge in that either. So what this means is I think when you frame things that way, when you're like, look, what you are doing when you are having sex with someone else for pleasure is you're basically using another human being like a fleshlight.
Yeah.
Like, why? Like you functionally are getting nothing additional out of it other than any hormones that force some sort of a bonding to you. And insofar as it's creating hormones that force a bonding to you, then you're using it as a tool to brainwash the other individual, which, okay, yes, learn to use that tool well, but
Well,
recognize what you're doing and that is the purpose of sex in those
there's
circumstances,
an
which is
argument
not
that
your personal gratification.
a lady or gentleman with a weaker imagination may just have difficulty getting the same enjoyment from not exactly the real thing.
Mm. Well, I mean, I think that framing for our kids will work,
Yeah.
in terms of leading them to understand that sex is a tool that can move them towards their goals, but
Yeah.
it is a tool that it goals the big one that sex helps with is getting someone to marry you, but and then have kids with you.
Wait. Wait. So you think you're more likely to marry someone if you've already had sex?
As a guy, yeah.
As a guy, yeah. I guess because
As a
what,
guy, you
you
can
can be
use
sure
it
that you're
to
not sexually incompatible because that's kinda scary if
No,
you
like
don't
I
know.
had I mean, the way that you can get women basically indebted to you, like get them to have a not supernatural is the wrong word, but I mean is
Oh,
beyond
so
what they would
you're talking
naturally
about, like,
perform.
oxytocin and, like,
Yeah,
hormonal bonding. Okay, okay.
utilize that to achieve bonds with people that then you can then utilize to or exploit, whatever you want to say, to better achieve your long-term goals.
Okay.
Insofar as you don't hurt them. And keep in mind, if there's somebody who's out there going to be having sex anyway, like people would be like, how did you ruin all these women? After the first few, I was like, okay, no, I'm only gonna go for the type of girl who I know would otherwise go out there and have sex with people. So yeah, that's how we're going to engage with sexuality with our kids. So I think the question is, what outcome are you aiming for? Are you aiming for Ayla, who I think, we love Ayla, really smart person. I think that the strategy that she has chosen, she's really pioneered it. And I think it's shown that even if you are the best at the world at what she does, it's still hard to find a husband if you take that path.
Mm.
And so I wouldn't recommend it for our kids. So do you want to take that path or do you want to take our path? Our path is extreme and total sexual education, allowing your kids to be exposed to sexual information at a young age, normalize it and treat it as something that you as a parent are engaging them on? Or do you extremely restrict sexual content, tell them to restrict masturbation and don't engage them with pornography? Is that the path you want to take?
Right, so that we're essentially saying traumatic exposure versus sheltering.
Well, not traumatic exposure, normalization.
I think if my parents no, I guess if my parents told me, like, the logistics of anal, for example, I wouldn't be traumatized, but
You'd never have anal. You never
I'm
would
not into
anyway.
anal anyway. Like, I guess I should, like, go a better description of, like, something I'd be into, like shibari. No, yeah, then I would be much less likely to do it. Yeah, it's true. Did even if it's something I'm kind of inclined to.
Sorry, that's the not tying thing.
Uh-huh, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a swaddler. So, um, yeah.
She likes being restrained is what she's saying.
It's very well, I mean, it makes sense. I think, like, I would imagine that the proportion of autistic people who, like, if they were asked to choose sexual fetishes that, like, were the sexual equivalent of a weighted blanket, they would probably I
You
mean-
are such a goof, Simone, and I absolutely love you.
But no, yeah, you're right. If my parents had been like, learn about this, I would be like, maybe I will never do that. Okay, let's do this to our children. We're so terrible.
No, no, no.
Foo, 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 foo. It's gonna be good.
That's what the forward on the Pragmatist Guide to Sexuality says, that we have ruined sex for our children for life.
Well, that's why
This
we
is in the
dedicate the
popular
book to them, because at least they have that.
Mm.
Yeah.
All right. Love you, Simone.
I love you too.